Welcome back to Final Trade. Today we are going to be talking about one of the most beloved and enduring decks in the Vintage Magic era that lives on in some form even to today, White Weenie. Now, when this game originally came out, the developers really respected the color wheel, and they really had firm ideas for how each color should be differentiated from the others. And so red has its big, terrible dragons and things like that, and black has its undead, and green has all of its big beasts and elephants and rhinos and worms and things. Blue kind of has phantasmal creatures and sea creatures. And what was white's? White's thing was soldiers, small creatures, things like humans, stuff like that, that would make up its kind of fighting force. And so these are some of the early ones here. So, of course, the great Benelish hero, your 1 mana, 1/1 banding. And to go with it, the Pikemen, the Mesa Pegasus, the Tundra Wolves with First Strike, and of course, the White Knight, the granddaddy of them all, the Savannah Lion, the broken 1 mana 2/1, and the Sarah Angel. So that was kind of the original lineup in, Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, through to 4th edition, was those kind of creatures. And of course, the developers continue to add more over time. Samite Healer was actually an early one too, but it's just not as good. Preventing the damage has just never been a great mechanic in Magic, but he's a cheap creature and he fits the bill. Getting past the initial few sets and even past the 4 Horsemen sets, Acacian Infantry, which you can optionally give that banding or first strike, the Acacian Javelineers with their small amount of direct damage, a copy of the Benelish Hero and the Keldoran Warrior, and the Shield Bearer. I think the Shield Bearer actually appeared earlier than Ice Age here, but was reprinted in Ice Age. And so there was never any shortage of small white creatures to go into White Weenie decks in the early history of Magic, and even through the late Vintage era, and as I said earlier, on through to today, there's, White Weenie continues to be a popular deck style for casual play. Order of Liber and Order of the White Shield, these are the famous Pump Knights. You'll hear referred to as that sometimes. So just exact copies of each other, but and the Longbow Archer, this one I think is way underappreciated. I love this card. It's kind of an alternative to the White Knight. 2 mana, 2/2, first strike. But a lot of the times that being able to block creatures with flying, I think it's called reach nowadays, a lot of the time that's more valuable than protection from black. Obviously, when you're not playing a black deck, it's more valuable. Sarah Zealot, just a copy of the Tundra Wolf from Urza Saga. Pegasus Charger, 3 mana, we can start to argue about whether that really qualifies as the kind of mana curve you want to play in a White Weenie deck. You're always looking for cheap small creatures. Mother of Runes, such a broken card. I mean, a 1 mana creature that can basically block and stop any creature in the game. And, a little factory there to produce more creatures, the Keldoran Outpost. I remember I picked up this copy of Keldoran Outpost at a card store in downtown Houston for about $7 sometime around 1997. And I just thought I was getting absolutely ripped off. But great card, and I believe Keldoran Outpost is reserveless. I may be mistaken on that, but I think it is. So White Weenie decks would have as a staple these large number of small creatures, and the Sarah Angel is kind of the exception. 5 mana is a pretty steep for a cheap creature deck, but it would be loaded down with creatures like this, and the idea would be to spam out a whole lot of cheap creatures. And then it had various ways to augment those creatures to make them more powerful. So obviously the original and greatest is Crusade, and again, this is another card that goes back to Alpha Beta Unlimited era. And just for the efficiency of increasing the power of your army, nothing beats it. Later versions, Divine Sacrament with the silly threshold capability. When I'm playing Magic with my wife, one of us will play this deck very commonly, a White Weenie deck, and we've never had threshold activate. It seems like such a silly capability. Glorious Anthem, slightly different. It's all creatures you control instead of all white creatures or white creatures you control. And, later on in Magic's history, white would get 12 or 15 different anthems like this. I mean, I found a comprehensive list once, and it was just preposterous, the number of anthems that they had. And then you had these kind of weaker versions, so only gives toughness and not power. And then castle that gives much more toughness but no power. When I was a poor kid in high school, I played with these because I only had one or two crusades, and now I play mostly with these because they're more well-rounded and versatile. But if you play White Weenie with all of this large number of small creatures, and then you use your anthems to buff them all up at once, and you end up with a large army of medium's power. Now, there were a number of individual creature enchants that were popular in the era, none more than Spirit Link. Very, very popular was to throw the Spirit Link on the Sarah Angel, and because she did not tap to attack, then you have that threat of gaining 4 life when your opponent attacks you, and gaining 4 life on the next turn when you attack your opponent. So it was a very potent combo. Holy Strength. In my opinion, this is not nearly as good as Black's version. Unholy Strength, it's probably not as good as Immolation, which is kind of Red's version. I think both of those are better than this because they're more focused on power and less on toughness. And I think offense definitely has the advantage over defense in Magic. But they're nonetheless, and if you were to make a Alpha Beta Unlimited period correct White Weenie deck, you would probably include this just because the selection of cards is so small. Or if you were doing something like playing the old Chandelar Magic computer game from 1997, you'd probably play with this because the catalog of cards available in that game is very small. And Divine Transformation, the 4 mana for +3/+3. Again, it's when the catalog of available cards was smaller, this was a pretty viable option. Personally, I'd rather just have another Sarah Angel in the deck. But as you got into, say, the Ice Age era or Mirage block, and certainly by the time of Tempest block, you had enough cards to choose from that you probably would not have picked this. And then there's a whole selection of these instants that will buff your whole army. And so these are kind of great things to surprise on your opponent after they've selected blockers or after they have committed attackers. And then you can buff your whole army at once. My favorite here is Morale, just because it's +1/+1. Again, it's more well-rounded, and attacking has the advantage over defending. But there was no shortage of these. Here's all blockers +1/+1, all blockers +0/+3, and all blockers 0/1, and you get to untap all your blockers, which is another interesting effect to basically give you an asymmetric advantage. And then getting into the disruption aspect of White Weenie, of course, Swords to Plowshares, one of the classics and best. Disenchant, no replacement for it. This is just one of the color-defining cards of White. And Armageddon, surprisingly, I think this is a good card for White Weenie because you have a much shallower mana curve than most decks you're going to be playing against. And if you have a lead in creatures, what better to do than destroy all the land and hurt your opponent's mana capability more than it's going to hurt you. Plus, if you've got a land tax out, you probably have several lands saved in your hand, so you can play the Armageddon and immediately play another land and have a mana advantage. And speaking of that, 2 utility cards that I love in these decks, Land Tax and Scroll Rack. Land Tax, of course, a very, very broken card. It basically can give you a 3-card advantage every turn. You can thin basic land out of your deck. You can make sure that you keep playing a mana every turn for a long time. There's no downsides to this, and it's so preposterously cheap. 1 mana to put it out. And then it feeds Scroll Rack so well because you can every turn pull 3 basic lands out of your hand. You can play none of them if you like, so that you continue to stay at a land disadvantage and you can keep playing land tax every turn. And then you just feed all those cards into Scroll Rack to pull out spells that you can cast. And so if you get into, turn 5, turn 6 of a game and you have both of these out and you have 4 or 5 cards in your hand, you can really just start accumulating some massive card advantage between these two cards. Now, you've probably noticed this banding keyword, and you may or may not be familiar with it. Banding has an interesting story, and it's kind of a sad loss for white weenie decks. Banding was this neat keyword early in Magic's history. It goes back to Alpha. But by the time of 1997 in Weatherlight and 5th edition, it was eliminated from the game. They stopped producing creatures with banding after Weatherlight in 5th edition. And I read an interesting post that Mark Rosewater, the lead designer for Magic, made. And he talked about how essentially they decided that banding was too complicated. There were too many questions about it. And the reason it's a shame is that banding is one of these things that's like the idea behind banding and white creatures and the way white armies are constructed in Magic the Gathering is that it's a whole bunch of little creatures. It shouldn't be a couple large creatures. You're not thinking of stuff like Lord of the Pit. Instead, you're thinking of a lot of small creatures. And so the way banding worked is you would have these groups and say these 3 creatures have banding on them. So they could form a band with up to 1 additional creature who did not have banding. And then basically they attacked as a group. And so they would all go charging together as a group. And now the whole group could be blocked by 1 creature, or the whole group could be assigned to block 1 attacking creature. But the real advantage was when you were defending with a group of banding creatures, you got to decide how the attacker's damage was distributed amongst your band of creatures. And so, of course, you would choose to distribute it in ways that minimize the number of creatures that you lost. And, banding kind of played in really nicely with this archetype of white creatures being the small swarm of human soldiers on this battlefield dominated by these large, fantastic creatures and these monsters and dragons and other things. And so I think it was a real loss that the designers did away with banding eventually. And, I'm kind of the opinion that if the effect was too complicated, well, you probably could have done a lot by simply figuring out a better way to explain it. And the way I've explained it here does not do justice to how complicated it is, because you get into all these weird things like, what about when 1 creature in the banding pack has flying? How does that affect things? And what happens when 2 banding packs, 1 attacks and 1 defends? And what about when individual ones within those packs, 1 has flying and 1 can block creatures with flying and things like that? So it does get very complicated, but I really feel like they could have tweaked the rules just a little bit, made it just a little bit simpler, and kept banding. And it would have been a great thing going forward to kind of preserve how special the color wheel originally was within Magic. But, eventually the designers just kind of threw the whole color wheel out the window, mixed up the capabilities of every color, and now every color kind of does everything. So I don't know, it's kind of a worry for people like me who are more interested in vintage Magic. So what am I playing in my modern version of a vintage white weenie deck? Heavy on the creatures, of course, with low mana cost. 4 of the Tundra Wolves and 4 of their copies, the Sarah Zealot. So and along with the 4 Mothers of Runes, that's 12 creatures that cost 1 mana to play. 4 of the White Knights and 4 of the Longbow Archers, so you have 8 creatures that cost 2. And then 4 of the Pegasus Chargers, so you have 4 creatures that cost 3. So that gives you 24 creatures in a 60-card deck, and 20 of those 24 have First Strike. And First Strike is a very powerful capability, especially when you have a bunch of creatures with it. It's almost a capability that gets more powerful the more creatures you have with it. Then I have 4 copies of Crusade, 4 of Divine Sacrament, and 4 of Glorious Anthem. So 12 total +1/+1 anthems in the deck. So you have this huge number of cheap creatures, and then you have these anthems that cost 2 or 3 mana each to buff up all the creatures. Disruption cards, 2 copies of Disenchant and 1 of Swords to Plowshares. the 3 land taxes, and the 2 scroll racks. And so the interesting thing about this deck is how well it does against other very powerful, well-known vintage era decks. Against Sly, for example, it'll win about half the time, but it's like it's perfectly tuned to take advantage of Sly. You know, Sly has the Fire Slinger that can deal 1 direct damage. Well, if you get out a single one of these 12 Anthem cards, the Fire Slinger can no longer just pick off 1/1 creatures. And the same with the Mog Fanatic. Now you need to use either 2 Fire Slingers or a Fire Slinger and sacrificing a Mog Fanatic. Or you need to use an Orcish Artillery. Well, if you get out 2 of these 12 Anthems, then the Orcish Artillery can no longer pick off individual creatures that you have. And the first strike, 20 creatures in the deck with first strike, it absolutely shuts down Ball Lightning. So it's really interesting to see how this deck does against something so powerful as Sly. The same with Suicide. You know, that's a pretty even matchup, but again, the creatures just start to overwhelm in this deck between the volume of cheap creatures you can play and then the anthems making them all bigger. It's a very, very focused deck on that. It's a lot of fun to play. And the really neat part about this is that most of the cards, with the exception of Land Tax and Scroll Rack, most of these are pretty cheap cards. You know, all of these creatures, you're talking, 25 cents each. The Mother of Runes is a couple dollars each. Crusades are obnoxious to try to get since they're a verboten card now, but you have to go on eBay, which is a bit dysfunctional of a marketplace. And, you can find cheap copies on there for a couple dollars each. The same with these on TCG Player. Disenchants, of course, just a few cents. And Swords to Plowshares are a couple bucks. So with the exception of the Land Tax and Scroll Rack, you could build a deck like this for, $30-$40. In fact, the land is going to be one of the most ridiculous parts when you go out and actually price old vintage framed land. It's a fun deck to play. It's got a long history, a great following, and it's a shame about banding, but the deck lives on even to today and is a popular deck for casual play. So if you like this kind of thing, join me here on Final Trade. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and come along. Thanks a lot.